Hello, everyone. Hi. I was joking in a workshop earlier today saying that there's this one song that I have that seems just applicable for every occasion, so I think I'll sing that with you. And hopefully you'll sing along a little bit as well. Maybe it's quite an easy song to learn. Yeah, I learnt it from a friend. It's from Liberia. Yeah, so try this. You and I will live as one. You and I will live as one. Beautiful. And again. You and I, we live as one. Nice. And you and I, 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 we live as one. You and I, we live as one. Nice. And then it repeats, and then you'll see what happens. The word live, it changes for other things. Pray and sleep and dance, sing. We live as one. You and I, we live as one. You and I, you and I, you and I, we live as one. And again. You and I, we live as one. You and I, we live as one. You and I, you and I, you and I, we live as one. Breathe. You and I, we breathe as one. You and I, we breathe as one. You and I, you and I, you and I, we breathe as one. Sing. You and I, we sing as one. You and I, we sing as one. You and I, you and I, you and I, we sing as one. But pray. You and I, we pray as one. You and I, we pray as one. You and I, you and I, you and I, we pray as one. What else do we do as one? Love.
Sit.
Love. You and I, we love as one. You and I, we love as one. You and I, you and I, you and I, we love as one. You and I, we sit as one. You and I, we sit as one. You and I, you and I, you and I, we sit as one. I cry. You and I, we cry as one. Hi, Abby. You and I, we cry as one. You and I, you and I, you and I, we cry as one. And live. You and I, we live as one. You and I, we live as one. You and I, you and I, you and I, we live as one. Hey, what's this happening?
That was really beautiful. Thank you, Jared. Thank you all to you for coming as well. This is the first time that I'm doing a Stronger on Sundays session in person. No, sorry, that's a lie. The second time I'm doing a Stronger on Sundays session in person. Can you hear me okay?
It's better with that.
Yeah. This is the second time I'm doing a Stronger on Sundays session in person. So I'm really glad that you're here. Just to give you a bit of background and to introduce myself. So I'm Melissa James. Here we have Joe Holtaway, who you just heard from. I'm a singer, performing artist. Further on from May 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests, I set up, well, initially I'd set up Stronger on Sundays to be a space to bring people together to help us get through lockdown. But after the protests, I felt I need to create a space where we can have deep conversations about racial injustice, social injustice, in a way that goes beyond just talking about the things we're used to discussing, diversity and inclusion. So that's how I created the program. It was taking place online. They still continue. There's no sort of definite frequency at the moment because there are lots to organise, so it's just when I can, essentially. But the aim is to make them more regular every month. So they take place on Zoom, and I invite a guest. So today, it's a very different, slightly different, because, you know, it's usually 2 hours. This is an hour. Joe is my guest, although together we're holding it really. It's a co-creation with you. And the theme that we're going to be discussing, there's always a different theme. The music is integral to each session because that helps us to be able to open our hearts and hold what are difficult conversations. So thank you for being here and daring to delve into a place that maybe you haven't delved before in relation to these topics. The topic that we're discussing today came from, as briefly as I can, a happening that arose a few weeks ago. I'm part of a vocal network which has a Facebook group. There are quite a few hundred members as part of this group. Most of them are white. And somebody just raised the question, a white woman, about her choir and whether she was asking whether we thought it would be a good idea to teach her choir, which is all white, a song by a blues singer called Leadbelly, who is very good, or was very good in the 20s, at creating songs, usually telling stories of slavery, but in quite a chirpy, not chirpy, that's the wrong word, but certainly a lighter way. And she was asking whether anybody thought it would be okay. She said, I like the song, could I teach this to my group? And I responded, no, I didn't think so. And that just led to conversations and led to me thinking, you know, what happens to the humanity if we don't see, perhaps, and this wasn't a judgment on her, but just because in a sense I was glad she asked the question, but how is there the disconnection that leads you to think that a song that's clearly talking about a woman holding her baby on a cotton field, what makes you think it would be okay to sing that with a group of white participants, just as part of a regular group? Which led me to think, how does that happen? And think about how the conversations around racism usually centre around the white-bodied person understanding the experience of those who are persecuted or who suffer at the hands of racism, as opposed to white-bodied people understanding what happened to white-bodied people at the hands of racism and the loss and destruction to white people at the hands of racism. So the loss is not, obviously, for the most part, you know, people like myself, we're suffering, living with racism is what you do. But the loss and the destruction is not just for us, it's also, you've had a loss. So when there are people who are white, and I presume we all are, in some sense, being here at Buddhafield, searching for something richer and a deeper meaning in life, there might be a sense that I need to search that from other cultures and other heritages, because I don't have this as a white person. But actually you did. And it's the creation of race, in the creation of white and black and brown, that we lost. There was a loss to you, and there was a loss to me, to us as well. So that's how that came about, and that's where we're going to go with the conversation. And then in wanting to explore that, I asked somebody for their thoughts, and they sent me an article. So I'm going to read, both of us are going to read a piece of the article, starting with Joe.
Would you like to introduce it, Melissa, or should we just go ahead and read it?
Yeah, okay, just to set the background. So this is a piece that was written in sometime in the 80s initially by a white man, a white American man, whose name is, I can tell you all of that afterwards. If you want to know, you can ask, and I'm happy to share it with you. But he was attending an event, so to speak, which was black, brown, white elders who were talking about culture. He didn't have the opportunity to share his thoughts because there were lots of people speaking, but this is what he wrote and what he would have shared had he spoken. And so we're just going to read, it's quite a long piece, we're just going to read a section because it helps set a bit more of the conversation.
Sure. Okay. As your wise Native American elders have shared, you know your roots. You know the language of your great-grandmothers from before white Europeans arrived and murdered your people and stole their lands. You know the customs of your people that go back 1,000 years, 5,000 years, some of you to the time of the original settlement of this area, just as the glaciers receded 9,000 years ago. And perhaps even tens of thousands of years before that, the ways of your people have been passed down all that time. Even during times of severe oppression, some of your wise elders were looking 7 generations ahead and preserving the language, wisdom, teachings, and ways of your people. These included the areas when the US government made it illegal for your people to use their language or practice their religion. Just want to read that bit again. These included the areas of when the US government made it illegal for your people to use their language or practice their religion. And your children were stolen from their families and sent to Christian church-run boarding schools. They extended through the times of mass murders and when your ancestors were forcibly moved from place to place and torn from their homelands. Through all this and more, your elders preserved many of your ways and knowings. For this, we must all be grateful. You are grateful, of course, because these wise ancestors and elders saw you in the future and held this for you, keeping your culture alive even in the darkest night of the coldest winter of oppression and genocide. My people must learn to be grateful, because in the wisdom of your elders and the ways of your culture may lie the seeds of a survivable future, a way out of the mess we whites have made of this world.
Please imagine something with me for a moment. It may be painful, but it is only an imagination, and there is a deep lesson in it. While it does not pardon or make acceptable what whites have done, it does help us understand why and how it happened. And even more important, it also explains why today so many whites are interested in your ways, some even desperate to become like you or one of you. Please follow this short story for a moment. Imagine that the white Europeans had been successful in their original plan. Imagine that the Christian whites had successfully forced all of your ancestors to abandon their language and speak only English, Spanish, or French. Imagine that all of the ceremonies had been lost so that today not even one single living person still remembers them or could teach them. Imagine that the white Christians from Europe had succeeded in ferreting out all the sacred places of your people and destroying every one, building churches or stores or houses over them, covering every last one with dirt or pavement or rocks, totally wiping them out. Imagine that every written record of your people, both those written by your own people themselves, from cave paintings to those records kept by people such as the Hopi, who had both oral and written traditions, was found through a most rigorous and thorough effort by the church and destroyed. None remained. Even the records of your ways, which were recorded by the early whites when they first came and observed your people, were burned by the church, because those records were demonic, according to the teachings of the churches of Europe. Even whites today could not read the voices of the first whites to meet your people hundreds of years ago. If this had happened, there would be not a single Native American on this Turtle Island continent who spoke any one of the more than 400 still living native languages. All these languages would be dead and forgotten. There would not be a single native who remembered that tobacco was a sacred plant or the significance of the 4 directions. Nobody would know how to sew a moccasin or prepare a spirit sweat lodge or even know what it was. Not any elders would be alive who could tell stories or remember even 5 words of the original languages. Among all the red people of North America, not even one single person would know what tribe he or she originally came from. All they would know was that they have dark skin and black hair, and that they are people different from the whites from Europe. But different how and why? In this imagination, nobody alive today knows. Nobody knows what the sacred ways of 200 years ago were, or 1,000 years ago, or 500,000 years ago. Nobody remembers what plants can be eaten and which are to be avoided. Nobody remembers that the earth is sacred, or where are located the most holy and the most dangerous places. Nobody knows how to call to the Great Spirit, the Creator, or even that there is one. Nobody remembers anything. All is lost. And I just feel I need to take a breath at that point. And I just want to take this.
Take it, stand away.
When I first began to sort of really, this has been a thought in my mind for a long time, and when it began to kind of unravel a bit for me after this conversation with this woman in this vocal network group, it felt like a light bulb moment. I was like, this is key to why we don't really move forward with this conversation, with this story around race and racism, because there's a lack of understanding from white-bodied people, but from all of us really, from white-bodied people, as to what their cultural heritages could have been. Because without that depth of understanding, we start to run into the territory of appropriation, I feel. We start then to seek, you're seeking something perhaps from somebody, from a culture, from a people. And if there's not the depth of understanding and the importance of understanding of these practices, because your heart is disconnected from land, and there's a closure to the connection to land on some level, there can't be, I feel, it's difficult to really kind of embrace the importance of the practices that you're wanting to learn about. So this is not to say that you shouldn't, knowledge is there to be shared, we shouldn't look to not gain from other cultures and heritages. But if you're doing it without having some real understanding of how they've come about and the importance of just a connection to land, and through our connection to land, that's how we develop a connection, that's how we develop culture, depending on where we're living. And we don't need to go to far off places necessarily to have that. For myself, I don't have elders who I've been taught by, who have talked and shared with me practices in relation to my heritage. It's been as simple as going outside to my local park and walking and listening and hearing and connecting to that land. And that has deepened my understanding of the importance of culture and these practices. So when I began to explore the practice of sweat lodges, it wasn't just this kind of feels like a nice thing to do and I've heard it's good. It was a calling from the work that I do in connecting with trees and plants and the earth, and understanding the importance of how you can do that. And that's just the whispers that come to me through my own practice. When I sang, I did a concert recently, and I sang Strange Fruit. I don't know if you know it. It's a jazz standard that was made famous by Billie Holiday and Nina Simone. And the words of this song describe hangings of African Americans who were by the Ku Klux Klan, essentially. You know, it's very potent in its and vivid in its image. I didn't feel I was ready to sing. I'd wanted to sing it for a long time, but I sang it at the concert a few weeks ago because I knew I was ready. Partly through doing these sessions and my exploration into understanding more about culture, about heritage, about the importance of who we are, connection. All of that made sense in terms of me singing that song. I wouldn't have done it before. And I'm Black. So for me, when I had this kind of light bulb moment, it felt so important to kind of try to bring this conversation here. And I tried to contact a few people to find out who I could invite to be part of this conversation. Slightly tentative, because I thought, well, they just think I'm crazy, you know. And eventually I did get a response. Well, I did get a response from a few people, and thankfully Joe agreed to come. But I'd like to share just a little of what you shared with me, Ilai. So Ilai has chosen, as a result of all of the other workshops that they're involved with here, I'm really sad that they can't share their own experiences with you now. But we were talking, and I was so moved by what they were saying. So being of Eastern European heritage, when they contacted me in response to my email, it was initially, yeah, I get that. I've thought about that a lot. And being Eastern European, it adds another layer to the complexity of it for me. But when we were speaking just earlier, the explanation was growing up in Poland and making that switch to becoming more Western European. It was not acceptable anymore to be practicing traditional practices, and Eli's grandmother would try to keep those things alive until was it 7 years ago you said she... So, you know, quite recent that the practices from Eli's grandmother would still be being translated on some level to her, folk stories and songs and herbalism. But this wasn't allowed anymore because the idea is that you have to become more white European, more Western European. So that's the process of things being wiped out, and that's so recent. Like that's now, right? And if you're losing that connection, then eventually there becomes the seeking for some other heritage from somebody else, but without the depth of really understanding, well, one, that you've lost something, you know, so they're just, it keeps alive this, I think, the savior complex of, as white people, I hold my chest, but as white people, we just need to hear the stories of those others who are persecuted. There's nothing that we have lost. There's nothing that we need to address. And I do understand, and Joe, you can explain in a moment, the sentiments of a friend of yours. In fact, can you tell us the sentiments of a friend of yours?
Yeah.
What her...
Yeah. Hey. Yeah, it's I was speaking to a friend of mine about this, and we were talking about terminology and about white people and about black people, and they're a scholar of race studies up in a university up in, they were working in London, now working in the north of England. And there's a constant view in academia, I think, especially around people who are trying to kind of work with ideas of racism, is about not reaffirming the dominant culture, to constantly look at the kind of colonial mindset, which is to re-establish or that kind of how that gets in, this kind of idea of whiteness, is that it's almost something a bit like the ego, you could say, in Buddhism, that keeps reaffirming itself in different ways. So my friend's kind of concern about these kind of ideas was that whiteness, by looking back at our culture and seeing what we've lost, it kind of re-centers a sense of the white person again having a loss and an issue. But I must say, like, I was very moved to have that explained by you, Melissa, and how, coming from you, there was, I think, a permission in myself to kind of recognise that loss in myself. And my friend and I, we resolved, as much as you can resolve anything to do with this, was to look at both those sides of things and saying, well, you have to acknowledge that there's been such a kind of power grab within the idea of having white skin, but also to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge the harm that that's caused as well to people that have that heritage. So that was kind of how, if that makes sense. Yeah. Thanks for asking. Yeah. I've been a fan of Melissa for a long time as a musician, and I wanted to take you back to that moment that you sang that song.
Strange Fruit.
Yeah, and I wonder if it might be something, if you could kind of explain, if there's people that don't know what that song is about, or if you could explain a little bit about it, and also, I don't know, there's just more to say about if you wouldn't mind talking about what it was like to actually sing that for the first time, and if you got any responses to that when you did.
I'll sing. In fact, I will sing the song at the end.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you.
So, do that.
Yeah.
But just to say, yeah, thank you for asking that. I mean, it was momentous for me singing that song, but it felt so right. It really felt like I've earned is the wrong word, but like I've reached a place where I feel I can carry that. I can carry that message of that song because of all the practices I do just on my walk in my local parks or forests or wherever it is I go. There is that understanding, and because of my walks, that has helped me to learn something more about myself. And in the end, I mean, all of these conversations they start to diminish because you realise that, of course, none of them matters really that much at all. My connection with the land and the universe is so much more important than all of these conversations about race. Yet at the same time, we are here needing to find ways of connecting with each other. And part of doing that, the way we connect better with others, is by understanding better ourselves, I feel. And I think maybe Eugene, as a psychotherapist, you might agree that that's true, would you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
As a Buddhist as well.
Sorry, say that again?
And as a Buddhist.
And as a Buddhist, of course, yeah. So it's, I mean, that's such an important, and also then I created a term which I quite liked earlier, performative activism. Like, in a sense, within the group that I described, the vocal network that's on Facebook, there was an element of performative activism with this woman asking the question in the first place. And ticking the box and asking the question, making sure that it's okay. And that's how questions like that get asked. And I know from conversations with white-bodied people who seem like they really want to be able to commit to doing more in terms of anti-racism and understanding the experiences of people who experience racism more. There is this sense that I know I'm doing this because I should and I want to, but I don't always understand why. And I think that's a heart thing, if your heart is open enough because you've gone through the process of developing an understanding, which doesn't necessarily mean experiencing or studying. It's not a head thing. It's not necessarily studying the cultural practices. I mean, you can, or understanding a history, the European history, but you can. But it's more just opening yourself up to getting a sense of what the practices are from your own experiences. So there was a talk recently that I was listening to with a woman called Pat McKay, who is an Indigenous woman from the Americas. And as part of that talk at the beginning, she did a song from her tradition, and she honoured the four directions. And one of the white participants who was present said, you know, I wish I had a cultural practice like that. And Pat McKay was like, you did, but as part of the construct of white, that got abandoned, you know, that got lost. So, yeah, and that, to me, there's an element of that feels a bit exciting. Like, I know for myself, like, as I'm exploring my own African heritages that I'm not aware of, you know, there's a level of excitement to that, as well as the sadness. I mean, there is up and down and left and right, and, you know, we have to have yin and yang, there has to be everything. Anyway, I've said quite a lot. I want to ask Joe, you talked, when we spoke earlier, you talked about being with the silence.
Ah, yes.
And what does, can you speak about that in relation to what we're saying here?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, so my name is Joe Holtaway, and I work within two traditions, two spiritual traditions. I work for the Quakers, and I've been going to the Quaker meeting now for about 15 years, I guess. I went earlier in my life with my mum, but more regularly, and I'm a children's worker with the Quakers. And I also am a student at Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh in Plum Village, some of you may know. And both of those traditions, I think I'm very drawn to them because of their relationship to silence. And within both of those traditions, there's a lot of time that you spend as a practice of being in silence and seeing what emerges from that silence. And I recognised quite early on kind of why that is so important to me. And I think subsequently I've seen a lot of people have come to those spaces within, I've worked with children, but also with who are there because their parents are there usually, but other young adults who are there of their own free will, have shared with me, and I've shared with them how nice it is to have that silence. And I recognise when I'm thinking about being at school, for example, or going to church, I used to enjoy the silence there, but there was never that much of it really. It was often about being told what to do, what to think, and it was all, I kind of reflected, even this afternoon actually walking around, how you listen often to a man at the front, often a white man pretty much all the time, telling you what Jesus had said, so on and so on and what so on. But then there was never really much time to reflect on it. And I'm not saying that that's the same with every church, but it's a memory that I've got, and it was a marked difference within Plum Village and Quakers, because you got a chance to be with yourself and see what kind of feelings were emerging from that. And I've become very interested in silence and what silence can bring. And I was thinking about the loss that has come from the kind of colonial mindset of wreaking havoc like throughout the world, but in doing so, kind of sowing the seeds of that in our own culture. In terms of, for example, how we've lost so much wisdom through the really it makes me quite emotional to think about it. And I just someone here called Abby that I met before, who works within herbalism, and I was thinking about all the women in the kind of lineage of that, who there was this period called the burning time when like so many women were kind of sought out, and they were sometimes involved with that, and they held like a lot of wisdom about the land. They were witches, they were people involved in paganism and this very rich tradition. And so many thousands, I think it's like hundreds of thousands of those women have they were lost, but also in that, like, their children were lost. And like I think that really, really touches me, because there's a kind of lineage there that's stopped in its tracks, and a wisdom that is so intimate that gets passed on from mothers and parents to their children. But to get back to the Quakers and Plum Village, it was sitting in the silence, I think, in those places that those traditions, maybe Plum Village less than the Quakers, I was going to say, both have in a way, have stripped back their root traditions. So Plum Village, Buddhism, they've kind of taken that back to some basics, and Quakers very much have taken practices, contemplative practices, back to a very simple room, sitting in a circle and allowing anyone to speak in the silence from their own experience, without any pre-planned stuff. So you just see what emerges and then you speak it. And there's a practice of that in the Plum Village tradition as well. And for me, I think when you said you were excited, it doesn't feel right to be excited about this stuff, but I think there is something so beautiful about being in that silence and then thinking what kind of cultural, new kind of connecting practices could come from that. And I kind of feel that that's where all practices have come from and all the practices we've lost. And although we're talking about such a big period of time where that stuff's been lost, it's got to start somewhere, and let that start now, I suppose. Thich Nhat Hanh, who started the Plum Village tradition, he said a lot of people come to my practice centres and they feel that they want to then go home, and he encourages them to do it, to go home and take those practices back to their own faiths and their own lives. And so that's been something I've been really interested in terms of, I want to ask you about your walks in Richmond Park, because I know that's one of yours. But I said to Melissa in a message recently that sometimes I feel like there's a practice in the Plum Village tradition of walking meditation. And actually, as a little plug, although I didn't mean to do it, we're doing some of them this weekend at 9:45 in Dharma Parlour. We're going to do some. Okay, 9:15. We're going to do some silent walks through the festival. And I know that when I started doing that, I used to you're encouraged to look at the nature around you, feel the contact of your feet on the floor and the breath in your body. And people often say they feel like children. And I kind of get this sense when I'm looking at nature, looking at the trees and the colours, like it's almost like I feel like I'm a child learning to read somehow, like there's so much wisdom there. And I'm sure that, and I feel I kind of almost, I don't know if jealous is the right word, but when I hear about people from other cultures who can read nature so well, I think, I want to understand that language, and I know that it takes time.
But you can.
But I can.
That's all I do, talk to trees. Not all I do.
And so, I think that's something that I want to cultivate in my own life as a practice. But silence is the place where it happens, I suppose. Yeah.
Completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Firstly, does anybody have anything that they want to say, or? Okay. So are we saying that we shouldn't be learning from other cultures, that's not the thing to do? I mean, I personally feel that, and I think I said earlier that, information and knowledge is to be shared.
Yeah.
And I think there's just an importance in understanding the weight of where it's come from. And when we talked earlier, I tried to give the explanation, which I'll try and use again, with the analogy of, we understand things in a monetary way now. If somebody, came up with the invention of some piece of technology and then, somebody else comes along and nicks it, and then goes off and starts to make money with it, the person who originally came up with the idea would be like, no, you can't take that. That's mine. I created it. And so we understand that there's not just the taking of something. I mean, I know it's not quite the same thing, although in a sense it is. And in this case, when we're talking about cultural practices and heritage, nobody's asking for any money necessarily. It's often wisdom is just shared, unless of course it's some sort of course or something where you have to pay to be on it. But often, wisdom is shared, and not necessarily for very much from the people who have this wisdom. It's more the acknowledgement, and I don't know if that seems like a clear analogy, but with a lot of these things, I think it is just the acknowledging and taking the time to really understand where it's come from. Because I think if there had been that understanding from this woman who asked the question in the first place, I don't think she would have needed to ask the question. And then the conversation that ensued was, so person A asked the question, but then there was a person B who, again, is a white woman, part of this vocal network, who said, well, I'm teaching that song, the Lead Belly Blues song about cotton fields. I'm leading that song with my choir at Maverick Festival, which is an Americana festival in Suffolk. And we've discussed it, in this sort of way. She was like, I've talked about the heritage of the song and what it means, but we feel it's okay to sing this at this festival. And I said, I don't think it is okay. Don't think it's okay. Especially the festival is, like a lot of jazz, blues festivals, they're celebrating music that has come from a particular cultural heritage, but many of the people on the lineup don't represent that. Most of the artists are white. I don't think you should be singing that song. And then she said, oh, well, can somebody suggest what I would sing? Because actually these songs are so good for singing with choirs. And they are. These blues songs and spirituals, they're really good for singing with groups. But it really, just this conversation made me think about another Lead Belly song, which I have sung with singing groups that I run. And I thought, actually, I'm not going to teach that. It's just, no. So they're just, as we shift and learn, as we learn, we shift how we can do things. And I think it's okay to accept that maybe what we were doing before was perhaps not quite the right way, and to have compassion for that. Can you talk a bit about compassion, and then I'll do the song before we finish?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can maybe lead on from what you said a little bit about a term that often comes up. I remember receiving a flyer under the windscreen wiper here one year, which was talking about being aware of cultural appropriation. And at the time I felt quite defensive. And I kind of felt like, when I first came to Buddhafield, maybe other people had the same experience, I felt like, wow, this is what I want festivals to be like. I think it's certainly the spirit of the people here, and the kind of so much eye contact and deep listening and talking, and it felt so good. And then I remember talking in a journey on the way home with a few friends about it, and feeling like, yeah, that is happening here. And in terms of, Buddhism, it's kind of taking something from somewhere else and learning from it. But ultimately, I think what I do reflect on as well is that how traumatized I am, and how traumatized maybe there's so much trauma in our culture around something that we've lost and that we're looking for in terms of spirituality. And it feels so good to find it in some way that's why, there might be symbols of other religions, other cultures. That's why they might be like a dream catcher in my window or something like that. It does feel so good. But then, as you were saying to me, Melissa, before, it's about kind of understanding what's happening there, I think, and then where that might kind of lead you, and that would lead to compassion, I suppose.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
And
Please.
one of the things that's always, just slightly frustrated me, I suppose, is that there's been quite a trend recently of there being a lot of cacao ceremonies taking place. I think, why are there so many cacao ceremonies all of a sudden? Do the people who are really holding these really understand the practice of cacao ceremonies and what they're about? Where, and it is a trend. Like, you see, there are
You know, there'll be music and dancing and drumming, and then it finishes with a cacao ceremony, and it's almost like, and I'm not saying that that shouldn't happen if you really really taken the time to really embody, not embody, but you know, feel it in the cells of your body to an extent as to what that means and the depth of the importance of that. But if you're just doing it because it's like, well, we're doing all of these practices, and then we'll do the cacao at the end, you know, because that's what happens. Then that's wrong on so many levels, you know, so many. So, yeah.
No, I was just putting. It's quite a sort of subtle thing that you're presenting, so I haven't really thought about it. But,
Would you take the mic?
Oh.
Is it? Yeah.
You don't have to if you prefer not to. But you're a speaker.
I was. Reach.
And I should say, Eugene has written a book on the race called The Race Conversation. This is Eugene Ellis.
Yeah. So just taking in what you're saying, and I'm sort of just trying to sort of hang on to it. I suspect others are the same. But I can see something there that's really important. So from what I'm hearing is that at some point the connection to the land was broken. If I go through history, doing a lot on the European history, I can see how that happened. Industrialization and everything. And from the land comes culture. Yeah, exactly. Okay. And then the culture, and then it's almost like a yearning for the alienated people from the land. So through industrialization comes alienation, isn't it? Sort of alienates. So then factories begin to build things that were once lost. So is that, have I got that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just trying to put it together in my mind, because that means that there's a big and this idea of going to another country, because not, you know, when you go to another country, if I go to say India or somewhere, I'm going there for the land. I'm going there for this experience of the land. So I'm going there for. I go to Jamaica and I want to go on the beach. I want to, you know, get myself in there. And if they come over here, they want money. And yeah, so it's kind of very interesting, just all that kind of thinking. And then, so there is a big loss. There's a massive loss there. I mean, you get this gain too, but there's also loss.
Yeah.
Yeah. And,
and a loss of power, which I think was the aim. You disconnect people from the land, and you disconnect them from the power to the land, understanding the land. When I go and stand next to rivers and sing, I'm fed messages, and the hurt, I can feel the pain. You know, these don't disappear and just go off somewhere. They're still there. You know, and we can learn how to voice those by going and taking time to be with trees, be with the rivers, be with the seas. You know, these aren't crazy practices. This is just communication, connection into beingness. That's it.
As humans, we need that.
I just want to say, I think, yeah, it comes down to capitalism, doesn't it? Trying to disconnect us from our roots. And like you said, with the factories, trying to get people off the land, and these sort of cultural practices. We used to have a way to unite people, and so they don't want people to be united. They want people to just be disconnected from their roots and disconnected from their communities. And with people being accused of being witches as well, I think a lot of that was about. Well, some of it was about women knowing what herbs to take and what to have for children, wasn't it? So they wanted women to have lots of children, lots of people to work in factories. So that was one of the reasons they sort of like tried to close down this sort of herbal knowledge. And obviously, like pharmaceutical industry starting up as well is another major one. And I think as well, I've been guilty of it in the past. You know, I still am into yoga, but looking at other spiritual practices, before I really realised. That's culture, that many of them. And so I think that a lot of people now, like white people, are hopefully, people I know, getting more into that. And, you know, I've got like half Irish, so I'm getting more into sort of like Irish Goddess Bridget heritage and practices and culture. So yeah, I think it's not all, it doesn't come from a bad place, like you were saying, but the more we can spread the word, there is a lot of Indigenous culture in British Isles that we can like to into many heritages, and there's a lot of stuff online and books being written with traditional herbs, and I feel that I went to one of the ancestors workshops earlier, and I was saying one way I felt connected to ancestors, but I know nothing about them on the English side, is by picking herbs, and like you said, being outside and making traditional remedies and healing myself in the same way that ancestors were done.
Yeah, yes, that's it. And just to say, we're all affected by whiteization, I am too, so I've thought, gosh, well, I've kind of done that to an extent too, because, here I am in a white dominant culture receiving lessons from what white culture believes are important to be learned, yet dismissing my African heritage, not seeking to understand more about my African ancestry. And I thought, why is that? Why don't I look to understand African spirituality practices? Why do I just seek to understand Asian spiritual? Not that it's wrong, but I mean, it's so insidious, racism. So I'm constantly questioning and undoing as much as I can. But, this is not something that's done in 2 hours. We embody so much in ourselves. And I have so many practices, and, from meditation, from talking to trees, from walking and singing by seas, and, and therapy, and all sorts of things. And yet it's still a continual, ongoing thing to reverse all of this from the fibers of my being, So we do have to have compassion for ourselves. And it's in the process of doing all of this and having that compassion, that's where the connection happens. That's where suddenly we're on the same page, because there's not you just trying to understand me from the point of being the white savior, essentially. There's you just understanding, gosh, this is what happened, this is what was done to me, and this is what was done to you in the process as well. So I'm gonna thank Joe Holtaway, who I didn't properly introduce, I'm so sorry. Yeah, thank you, Joe. Yeah, and thank you so much, Eli. Really, I just cried when we were speaking. Yeah, I'm going to finish with Strange Fruit, which I wasn't planning. I was going to do this really nice kind of soothing song, but this is soothing in a painful way. This is part of the healing. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar tree. Here is the fruit from the southern sound, the bulging eye and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. taste fruit, for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, and for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the leaves to drop. Here is a strange and bitter. Thank you so much for being here.